They found the first body in April when the snow finally melted. A horse, or what was left of one, stripped of every ounce of edible flesh, down to the bones, the skeleton arranged in a grotesque pattern like some kind of offering to pagan gods. Then they found the second horse, then the third, then the fourth. By the time the spring thaw revealed all 7 horses, the lawmen searching the Colorado wilderness understood what had happened, and it made their stomachs turn. The Frozen Creek Gang, 6 outlaws wanted for murder and robbery across 3 territories, had spent the entire winter of 1879 trapped in the Rocky Mountains, cut off by blizzards, hunted by Pazes who'd chased them into the high country before the first snow, and to survive 4 months in temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero, they'd done the unthinkable. They'd killed and eaten their own horses, the animals that were supposed to be their escape, their only hope of getting out alive. But that wasn't the worst of it, because when they found the camp itself, hidden in a canyon that shouldn't have been survivable, they discovered something else. Something that suggested the horses weren't the only things the Frozen Creek Gang had eaten that winter. Look at the photograph. 6 men standing in front of a weathered wooden building, heavily armed, dressed in frontier clothing and Mexican gear. The man second from the left in the back row, the one with ammunition belts crossed over his chest, and that 1,000-yard stare. That's Miguel El Lobo Cortez, and he's the reason these men ended up trapped in the mountains eating their horses. El Lobo earned his nickname after surviving alone in the Sonora Desert for 3 weeks with nothing but a knife. He'd killed a wolf with his bare hands, drank its blood, wore its skin. People said he could survive anywhere, that he was unkillable, that he had dark knowledge about staying alive in conditions that would kill normal men. He formed the Frozen Creek Gang in 1877, recruiting men equally desperate and dangerous. They robbed banks and trains across Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona, always escaping into wilderness areas where Pazes couldn't follow. But in November 1879, they made a mistake. They robbed a train carrying payroll outside Denver, got away with $40,000 but killed 2 guards and a Pinkerton agent. The railroad companies hired 50 professional manhunters and sent them after the gang with orders to bring them back dead or alive. El Lobo led his gang west into the Rocky Mountains. But this time, the posse didn't give up. They kept coming, driving the gang higher and higher, even as winter closed in. By late November, the gang was trapped at over 10,000 feet elevation with the first major blizzard moving in. They had 3 choices: surrender, shoot their way through, or go even higher into country considered impassable in winter. El Lobo chose the third option. He led his gang into a canyon system that local tribes called the Valley of Bones, a place where animals went to die. The posse, thinking the outlaws had chosen suicide, pulled back to wait for spring and the bodies they were certain they'd find. The Frozen Creek Gang disappeared into the winter wilderness with 7 horses, limited supplies, and El Lobo's belief he could keep them alive through anything. Look at that photograph again. Every man in it was a survivor before they got trapped. Standing on the far left in the back row is Thomas Black Tom Wade, a former buffalo hunter who could shoot, skin, and butcher an animal in under 20 minutes. He was completely amoral, would do anything, eat anything, kill anything if it meant surviving. Next to El Lobo stands James Cordova, half Apache, half Mexican. Cordova knew wilderness survival techniques, how to find water under ice, how to build shelters that held heat, how to read weather. He was also the most vicious fighter in the gang. On the far right of the back row is Patrick Red Sullivan, an Irishman who'd fled New York after killing a man. Red was the gang's cook and quartermaster, managing supplies and rationing food. He knew how to preserve meat, cure hides, and use every part of an animal. In the front row on the left stands Samuel Garrett, the youngest member at 24. Garrett was the gang's best rider and horse handler. He loved horses more than people, which made what happened that winter especially hard on him. Next to Garrett stands William "Doc" Preston, a former medical student. Doc knew anatomy, knew how to treat injuries with whatever materials were available. That knowledge would prove crucial during the winter, though not in ways anyone predicted. And on the far right sits Francisco Pancho Vargas, El Lobo's second-in-command and childhood friend. Pancho was a skilled trapper who knew how to hunt in brutal conditions. 6 men, 6 hardened survivors, trapped at 10,000 feet with winter closing in. The canyon had high rock walls that sheltered from winds, a spring-fed creek, and caves. On paper, it looked survivable. Reality was different. The first major blizzard hit in early December and lasted 5 days. Temperature dropped to 20 below zero. They had enough food for maybe 3 weeks if they rationed carefully. The horses had almost no forage, just bark from pine trees and whatever dead grass they could dig out. Red Sullivan calculated their situation. They had food for 3 weeks, but winter would last at least 4 months. The math was terrifying. They were going to starve unless they did something drastic. El Lobo made the first unthinkable decision 10 days in. They would have to kill one of the horses. Samuel Garrett argued against it. They needed the horses to escape when spring came, but El Lobo's logic was harder. If they starved, they wouldn't need horses. The horses were just animals, tools, and tools could be sacrificed. They drew straws. It fell to Garrett's own mount, a mare he'd raised from a foal. He wept while Black Tom Wade shot the horse in the head. Doc Preston and Black Tom spent hours processing the horse. They saved everything: meat for eating, bones for tools, hide for leather, organs for nutrition, even blood which Red mixed with snow and pine needles to make pudding. The meat fed 6 men for nearly 3 weeks, but it wasn't enough. The cold burned through calories faster than they could consume them. By New Year's Day, 1880, they killed the second horse. January was worse. Temperature dropped to 40 below zero. Blizzards trapped them in the cave for days. The creek froze solid except for a small opening they had to hack through daily. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Doc Preston amputated 2 of Red Sullivan's toes with a heated knife. No anesthesia except whiskey. They killed the 3rd horse in late January, then the 4th in early February. By March, only 3 horses remained, and the gang looked like walking skeletons. Their clothes hung like rags. Several men had scurvy. James Cordova's teeth were falling out. That's when El Lobo made his second unthinkable decision. They'd found another cave deeper in the canyon with frozen human remains. 3 bodies, maybe prospectors or trappers who died in a previous winter. The bodies were preserved by the cold, frozen solid. El Lobo told the gang they needed to consider all options. They'd already crossed one line by eating their horses. The next line was darker, forbidden, but they were starving. Winter wouldn't end for another month. The gang split on the question. Garrett absolutely refused. Doc Preston said it was madness that diseases could be transmitted. Red Sullivan wouldn't do it on religious grounds. He was Catholic and considered it mortal sin. But Black Tom Wade had heard stories from fur trappers about winter starvation, about what men did to survive. Pancho Vargas said his village in Mexico had old stories about the starving times. James Cordova knew his Apache people had stories about the Wendigo, about spirits that consumed human flesh. El Lobo didn't force anyone. He said anyone who wanted to survive should do what they had to do. 3 men, El Lobo, Black Tom, and James Cordova, ate what they found in that cave. The other 3 refused but stayed in the gang, kept sharing the horse meat, kept surviving together despite the horror. Doc Preston later wrote that this was when they became something other than men, that they'd crossed a line separating the civilized from the savage. March brought worse storms. The fifth horse died from starvation. It collapsed one morning and didn't get up. They butchered it immediately. The sixth horse lasted until early April. When they killed it, Garrett couldn't watch. Now they were down to one horse, and spring still hadn't come. They were all suffering from frostbite, scurvy, starvation, and a kind of madness from being trapped in the cold and dark for so long. Red Sullivan started seeing things. Samuel Garrett talked to himself constantly. James Cordova would stare at nothing for hours, occasionally laughing at jokes only he could hear. El Lobo held them together through sheer will. He organized work details, someone maintaining fire, someone checking ice for water, someone watching for the posse. He kept them moving, kept them from giving up. But they were at the breaking point. They'd eaten 6 horses. They'd done other things. And they still had one horse left, their last possible escape route. The question became, kill and eat the last horse, or try to hold out until spring? El Lobo decided they would wait. They would survive on bark, roots, anything. They would keep the last horse alive because it represented hope, the possibility of escape. It was the first time El Lobo had chosen hope over survival, and it nearly killed them all. The posse had given up in February. Everyone assumed the Frozen Creek gang had died. No one could survive 4 months at that elevation. They were wrong. When the snow started melting in late April, 6 skeletal figures emerged from the Valley of Bones riding a single horse. They took turns. 3 men riding while 3 walked, switching every few hours. They made it down to a ranch where they stole food, fresh horses, and supplies. The rancher got a good look. 6 men who looked like they'd died and come back. Hollow-eyed, gaunt, moving like ghosts. He'd never seen men look so haunted. The gang split up after that. They divided the $40,000 they'd buried before winter and went their separate ways, agreeing never to speak of what happened in the mountains. El Lobo disappeared into Mexico and was never heard from again. Some claimed he died there in 1885. Others swore they'd seen him in the Sierra Madre Mountains in the 1890s, living like a hermit. Black Tom Wade was found dead in a Denver flophouse in 1882, frozen to death despite being indoors with a fire burning. Residents said he'd been terrified of the cold, that he'd died shivering and mumbling about the mountains. James Cordova returned to his mother's people and became a shaman, claiming he'd seen the Wendigo spirit. He died in 1891, though tribal elders said he'd actually died years earlier in the mountains, and what came back was something else. Patrick Sullivan entered a monastery in 1881 and spent the rest of his life in prayer and penance. He never spoke of it directly, but wrote cryptic letters about sin and survival. Samuel Garrett became a veterinarian and spent his life caring for horses, trying to make up for the ones he'd eaten. His last words were reportedly an apology to a mare named Sally, the first horse they'd killed. Doc Preston wrote a memoir published in 1905 after his death. He described the winter in clinical detail, everything except the worst parts. Where those parts should be, pages were torn out, and a note said some things should not be written, some truths should not be preserved. When lawmen finally made it up to the canyon in summer 1880, they found the camp. 7 horse skeletons arranged in a circle around the cave mouth. Inside evidence of 4 months of desperate survival, gnawed bones, makeshift tools, a calendar scratched into the cave wall. And deeper in the canyon, in that other cave, they found evidence of the things the gang had done to survive. Things that made hardened lawmen turn away. Things that confirmed the darkest rumors. The authorities sealed the canyon. They didn't want curiosity seekers disturbing what they found. The official story was that the gang had survived by eating their horses and whatever game they could catch. Period. Nothing else. But the men who'd been there knew the truth. In private, late at night, with enough alcohol, They'd admit the Frozen Creek gang had done the unthinkable to survive. Multiple unthinkable things. Things that made eating their horses seem almost reasonable by comparison. Look at that photograph one final time. 6 men standing in front of a building, heavily armed. The man second from the left in the back, El Lobo, looks strong, confident, dangerous. You'd never know from that photograph that he'd lead these men into the mountains and bring them through a winter that should have killed them all. You'd never know what they'd eaten to survive, what lines they'd crossed, what pieces of their humanity they'd left behind in that frozen canyon, along with 7 horse skeletons. The Frozen Creek gang proved that humans can survive almost anything if they're willing to do absolutely anything. They survived 4 months at 10,000 feet, in temperatures that reached 40 below zero. They survived by eating their horses, their only means of escape. They survived by doing other things that official reports don't mention and survivors never discussed. They proved that survival is possible even in impossible conditions. But they also proved survival has a cost, that some things you do to stay alive change you so fundamentally that you're never the same person afterward. Every man in that photograph was different after that winter, haunted, broken, changed in ways that couldn't be undone. They'd survived, yes, but the men who came down from that mountain weren't the same men who'd gone up. They'd left parts of themselves in that canyon, their innocence, their humanity, their sanity. The Valley of Bones earned its name that winter, not because of what died there, but because of what survived. Because sometimes the things that live through hell are more terrifying than the things that die in it. The Frozen Creek gang, 6 men who ate their horses to survive. And the horses weren't the worst of it. That's what the photograph doesn't show. That's what the official records don't say. That's what the survivors took to their graves. The full truth of what they did in that frozen canyon to stay alive, when staying alive required becoming something less than human. Look at El Lobo in that photograph. Second from the left, ammunition belts crossed over his chest. That 1,000-yard stare, he kept them alive. He led them through the impossible winter. He made the unthinkable decisions that saved them. But the price was their souls, and you can see it in their eyes if you look close enough. All 6 men have the same look, the look of people who've seen and done things they can never unsee or undo, who survived by crossing lines they can never step back over. The Frozen Creek gang, they ate their horses to survive the winter, and that was just the beginning of what they did in the mountains. The rest stays buried in that sealed canyon in Colorado, in classified reports that will never be released, in the nightmares of the men who were there. Some survival stories inspire, some teach valuable lessons, and some, like the winter of 1879 in the Valley of Bones, remind us that humans are capable of absolutely anything when the alternative is death. And that's not always something to celebrate.